The pcfx was NEC Home Electronics and by association Hudsonsoft's successor to the popular PC Engine platform that was first introduced in 1987. The PC Engine for a short while became Japan's second most popular platform behind the Famicom, and even early on outsold it, but its total sales of around 5 million, as reported in part 3 of this series, meant that it never caught up with the Famicom overall. Still, it was a success and expectations for the next machine were high. The pcfx was officially launched on December 23rd, 1994 and followed on the heels of other 5th generation consoles in Japan that came out earlier, namely the 3DO, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation and the Mega Drive extending Super 32X. Subsequently, the Virtual Boy and Nintendo 64 would also be part of the so-called 5th generation, coming in 1995 and 1996 respectively. The pcfx is a curious machine, not so much for what it actually is, but rather the mystique that surrounds this locked-in Japan console.
Yeah, Hormina, Saki Endo here. Now, you probably weren't expecting me to pop up in this episode, but I gotta say, Vix is far too polite for her own good. Before I hand over the reins back to her so she can explain the console, some of its games, as well as extensive research into its development, there's a lot of what I can call charitably regurgitated information on the internet about the pcfx, or what I believe the British call, bollocks. I'll leave you with this. If you check the Wikipedia page on the pcfx, you'll find this statement under the reception heading. It reads clear as day that Famitsu ranked the pcfx 1 point lower than the Sony PlayStation in a console cross-review in their May 12, 1995 edition, which means Famitsu clearly felt the pcfx and PlayStation were almost on a par. Right? Well, actually, no, because if you look at the article in the magazine, it does indeed have a cross-review of the consoles on the marketplace, reviewing their respective CD playback quality and features. It is in no way about the consoles themselves as an overall rating. Janene?
Before we get too deep into how and why Hudson and NEC misjudged the 5th generation console race, let's look at the machine and some of Hudsonsoft's games for it. The pcfx is a 32-bit machine and loaded its games from CD-ROM, something Hudsonsoft and NEC had innovated back in 1988 with the PC Engine CD-ROM platform. Powered by NEC's 32-bit V810 at 21 MHz and with 2 MB of work RAM, it was similar in this regard to other 5th generation consoles. Coming in a very mid-90s mini-tower form factor, it was not the most compact or conventional games console design. The pcfx controller looks very much like the later PC Engine Duo RX controller, with 6 face buttons like a Sega Saturn pad, but lacking the former's turbo switches and no shoulder buttons like the Saturn pad. Thankfully, 2 controller ports were built into the machine, negating the need for a multi-tap. Peripherals such as a mouse were also available, as well as eventually kits to connect the pcfx to an NEC PC98 series system to use the console as a CD-ROM drive. The pcfx had no hardware 3D capability and relied on sandwiching older PC Engine era technology with newer technology such as 24-bit full-color graphics and the much vaunted motion video. Video output was achieved by either composite or S-video. Hudsonsoft released a small number of games for the platform before bowing out in mid-1996, a mere 18 months after the platform's release. As I don't personally own a pcfx, instead of mini reviews of the games, I'll give you an overview of some of Hudson's standout titles, not necessarily great games, but ones that are notable for the system. Battle Heat headlined the system's much vaunted FMV playback capability, and it does look beautiful, but in gameplay, it really feels awkward, and like any FMV game, is relying on timing of successful inputs. Personally, I can't get past the feeling that the game is controlling me rather than the other way around. Team Innocent is an interesting if slightly short adventure game where you have 3 missions with different goals that need to be achieved. Exploration is the name of the game, finding objects and using them to achieve your goals. Movement is a little awkward in the pre-rendered backgrounds with sprites rendered over the top, showing some unusual scaling. It's worth persevering with though, as there is a moderately interesting game here. Sadly, Tengai Makyo Namida, the third mainline installment in the very popular RPG series, was announced for the pcfx, but it never materialised until much later on the GameCube and PlayStation 2. However, the system did get another FMV fighter based on the property, Deno Karakuri Kakutoden, roughly meaning Cyber Brain Fighting Legend. Unfortunately, much like Battle Heat, I find myself bouncing off of this title in much the same way, though the characterizations are brilliant, including series favourites Jiraiya and Kabuki Danjuro. At this time, Hudson Soft were deeply involved in producing games for the Kishindoji Zenki franchise and released what I think is their best PCFX game, Vajra Fighto, a game that describes itself as one fight after another with drama. It's essentially a beat-em-up, but graphically it looks really polished, taking on a classic 2D action approach in gameplay. Sadly though, it's a short game and over before you know it. Perhaps the biggest miss is ironically not making more use of the PCFX's FMV capability, as when characters engage in dialogue mid-journey, they are accompanied by a basic flapping mouth and not that much more, missing the opportunity to connect with the franchise's characters. Hudson Soft's last game for the PCFX was Super Power League FX. Not being a big follower of baseball, my opinions on this game are scant, beyond my observation that it looks like a mildly warmed up PC Engine game, the previously released Power League 93 on HuCard. It seems to play nice enough, and it's intuitive to control, but it does nothing to make the PCFX feel part of the fifth generation of consoles for me, beyond its chintzy opening cinema, something of a swing and miss for me. And that's almost all of Hudson Soft's PCFX output, excepting an installment from the Ginga Ojo-sama Densetsu Yuna franchise, Kanashimi na Siren. When compared to what Saturn and PlayStation owners were enjoying at a similar time, it's little wonder that the more expensive PCFX failed to catch on, and that Hudson Soft saw the writing on the wall when they bowed out in mid-96. Meanwhile, in 1995 and 1996, Hudson was still producing quality titles on the Super Famicom, Game Boy, PC Engine, and soon the Saturn. We'll look at some of those in detail in the next episode.
Next! Do it!
フルアニメーションゲームマシン pcfx.
The game is FX!
NEC
起きてください博士。
なんか言った
3D リアル3月20日 54% です。博士。
なんか言った
Panasonic
あのバーチャファイターを完全移植、さらにセガサターンだけのオリジナル機能も楽しめる。
10年早いんだよ。
誕生バーチャファイターセガサターンから
セガ。
世界で初めての完全立体映像ゲーム機バーチャルボーイ誕生。左右の目に異なる映像を映すことでテレビゲームでは表現できない立体感を生み出した。テニス、ボクシング、マリオの立体アクションゲームなど同時発売。バーチャルボーイ、ゲームの新しい時代が始まります。
In spite of Japanese economic woes due to the asset price bubble collapse, in 1992 Hudson was doing well. For now, buoyed with confidence, Hudson unveiled its new 32-bit platform HUC62 at the January 1992 Winter CES. At the time it was labelled Hudson's Video System, and a connection to the PC Engine and or its successor was denied. Further concrete details were announced on May 18, 1992 at the Imperial Hotel in Hibiya at an event dubbed their 20th anniversary press conference. Detailing the system showcase at CES, Hudson revealed that their HUC62 was powered by 5 chips, with a motherboard looking every bit like a Skunkworks project with a PC Engine pad attached. The footprint of this board, which at some point got codenamed Tetsujin, meaning Iron Man in English, was much larger than the PC Engine's footprint, at around about 30 centimeters squared. Notable is also the fact that Hudson was doing their own thing, with little indication of NEC's involvement according to the press at the time. In Gekan PC Engine's coverage, the 5 key chips that made up the HUC62 were explained, but none dealt with 3D polygons. They were dedicated to decoding and displaying full motion video, including sprites, sound, and an apparently custom 32-bit CPU called the HUC62-320. Notably, there was no mention of hardware 3D capability in these chips within the article. What was explained was the system's playback of compressed JPEG images at 30 FPS for full motion video, a big thing at the time, which naturally had applications beyond just gaming. You have to bear in mind that JPEG was a new image format at the time. On a 68,000 powered Amiga 500, a small JPEG could take minutes to display as it was decoded, so streaming video in real time was a powerful feature in 1992. In addition, image morphing was once again demonstrated at this event. Perhaps more interesting, Shinichi Nakamoto's regular column in the magazine that appeared in the same June 1992 edition of Gekan PC Engine, where he detailed the driving force behind the focus on what would become known as full motion video, or FMV.
ゲーム作りにおいて最も大切なのはソフトの作りさなのです。最近のゲーム、特に CD-ROM ゲームは内容も非常に複雑で、制作するのに多大な努力を必要とします。また、そのゲームをチェックするのは作ることよりもさらに大変な作業になってしまいました。例えば、天外2のビジュアルシーンを例にとってみると、今までは緻密なデザインと神業的なプログラムで作ってましたのが、これがもしアニメと全く同じ手法でコンピュータの知識がなくても作れるとしたらどうなるでしょう？デジタル動画の技術を用いれば、今までコンピュータの知識が全くない映画やテレビやアニメなどのいわば畑違いのクリエイターたちがゲーム作りに参加しやすくなります。つまり、ゲームを作る人たちが今よりもかなり増えることになります。クリエイターが増えれば、結果的に今よりもたくさんのソフトが楽しめるようになるわけです。ただ単純に32ビットパワーが強力だとか、グラフィックが綺麗とか、音が良いとか、スプライトがたくさん出るということは当たり前であり、むしろそうしたことよりも、いかにたくさん有能なクリエイターがソフト作り参加できるのかということが重要なポイントになると私考えています。
In between all of this, NHK was promoting a new HD TV service, Hivision, which started public broadcasting in 1991. To complement this, Hudson worked in conjunction with NHK to create a game that would work on a new HD TV standard as it was then, as it was analog based. This resulted in High-10 Bomberman, a 16:9 widescreen aspect 10-player Bomberman tournament game that debuted at Hudson's Super Caravan event in 1993, and in 1994 was enhanced with High-10 Kiara Bomb, a game that featured many characters from Hudson's IPs, such as Bonk, Momotaro, Mylon, and so on.
そこでハイビジョン信号を出せるボードを作りて作成しました。そして PC エンジンを母体にしてコントローラー10個分の信号を取り入れる。
Some have suggested the Hivision capable board was a prototype pcfx, but whatever it was, this board's prototype name was Tetsujin, or Iron Man according to Takahashi Meijin. The next big concrete announcement on what had become called the FX broke in January 1994, where Gekan PC Engine covered an announcement by NEC of the PC Engine's successor. For one, the CPU had been changed to NEC's V810, and they doubled down on the FX's ability to play back video, much like the HUC62 platform previously demonstrated. When quizzed about 3D polygonal graphics, it was emphasised that adding that kind of functionality would have been too expensive for a games machine, and that in the end, Once the screen is displayed to the user, the image is flat anyway. This somewhat misses the wood for the trees, as exploring a 3D FMV environment is completely different to exploring a 3D polygonal environment. That said, NEC wasn't wrong about adding 3D capability being expensive. Sony knew this only too well as well, which is why when the PlayStation was launched in Japan, a whole advertising campaign called Ikuze Hyakumandai, meaning let's go 1 million units, was launched in 1995.
進みましょうか。
いえ、結構です。
持とうか。
いいよ。見てた。
みんな始めてる。行くぜ100万台。
プレイステーション。
Which seems a bit odd really, publicly saying, help us sell 1 million of these PlayStations. But the truth behind it is that 1 million units was the minimum number of PlayStations Sony had to sell to recover the costs of paying back LSI for the custom MIPS R3000 based CPU/geometry engine chip in the system. In addition, the PlayStation in particular had strong FMV capabilities that in terms of the frame rate was only held back by the double-speed CD-ROM drive, as the motion decoder in the PlayStation was in fact capable of more than 30 FPS. In the end, the pcfx's defining attribute was mostly down to NEC's movie encoding abilities, and once others mastered this, there was often little discernible difference despite assertions to the pcfx's superiority on this front. NEC's insistence on an FMV basis aligned with earlier statements made by Shinichi Nakamoto. The die was cast. The successor to the PC Engine, which would eventually be called the PCFX, was a dead Iron Man walking.
Oh, 32ビットのゲームだね。メガドライブが32ビットになるのさ。
ソフトも新次元グラフィックス。
しかもこんなに安いんだぜ。
すげえ。
スーパー 32X。
二人がもっと仲良くなるには何すればいいの？行こうか。どこへ？
行くぜ200タイトル。
すごいことになってきた。
プレイステーション。
今までのテレビゲームでは実現できなかったコンピューターグラフィックスアニメーションの迫力。任天堂64。3D スティックを使って初めて体験できる新しいゲームの世界。任天堂64。ゲームが変わる。64が変える。
After the PCFX's launch on December 23rd, 1994, the fifth generation initially seemed to place the Sega Saturn as the leading system based on the strength of Virtua Fighter, followed by PlayStation with 3DO and PCFX trailing significantly. Hiromasa Iwasaki was a key programmer at Hudson as well as writing for Beat magazine, initially as Dr. Damio. At Hudson, he had responsibilities for the PC Engine ports of Ys 1 and 2, debut CD-ROM titles Noriko and Fighting Street, and PC Engine bestseller Tengai Makyo 2 Manjimaru, and much more besides. According to Iwasaki-san's former blog, shortly after the launch of the PCFX, he and Shinichi Nakamoto talked over dinner where they discussed the state of the fifth generation console market and its likely victor, where Shinichi Nakamoto stated his opinion.
PS はブームだからサタンが一時的に勝って最後は任天堂じゃないかな。
Iwasaki affirmed in his former blog in 2010 that for Hudson, the main focus was PCFX, but aligned somewhat with industry opinion at the time by having Sega Saturn software as a sideline. After all, initially the industry judged the Sega Saturn as the likely victor over PlayStation.
当時、ハドソンはPS とサードパーティー契約をしておらず、セガとサードパーティー契約する方針をとっていた。つまり、メインは PCFX、サイドのラインにサタンというのがハドソンの考え方だった。
This is backed up by Hudson's conspicuous absence in the listings of signed-up PlayStation developers in 1994. But why? Did they think the PlayStation would fail and the Saturn would succeed? Not exactly. The root is in 3D itself. Whilst 3D had started to appear on consoles somewhat before, Nintendo's attempts with Argonaut via Star Fox, or Starwing as you may know it, was successful outside of Japan. But within Japan, it really wasn't quite the success that they hoped. Hudson took note of this and understood that whilst the PlayStation was indeed a 3D monster, the Saturn was superior in 2D and also capable of 3D at the same time, and decided based on this and the Japanese response to 3D on the Super Famicom that the Saturn was a likely winning bet.
セガサターンは 3D もやれる超高性能 2D マシンだったので、業界内では受けがとても良かった。
Iwasaki explains two key reasons I believe that lie behind Hudson's misjudgment. The first is the simple lack of awareness. They hadn't judged a shift in the industry towards 3D well at all. Their lack of recognition of the sheer popularity of 3D titles in the arcades, as well as the lack of experience of working with high-end 3D workstations, such as SGI's Iris and Indigo, combined with a cooler reception to 3D, as in Star Fox, backed this judgment up, in their eyes. And the fact that the PCFX had no 3D, that would be okay, so long as their judgment was correct. But sadly, it wasn't. But what of the rumour that the PCFX's 3D functionality was left out due to time restraints? Iwasaki is very blunt on this.
また FX について触れておくと、これはハドソンが手動で開発したマシンが Wikipedia に書いてある 3D を考えて開発していたが、チップが間に合わず、ああいったハードになったと書いてあるが、これはまるで嘘だ。要は彼らは PC エンジンの延長で動画強化すればいいと考えていたわけだ。
It sounds like a classic case of having created something admittedly very cool indeed, but then seeing it as the solution to everything, rather than taking a wider look at other things that may in fact surpass your own creation, or your own baby. I wouldn't call it hubris in the slightest, probably just misplaced enthusiasm of having invented a hammer and suddenly everything could be fixed with it. The PC Engine and PCFX Perfect catalogue from Hiroyuki Maeda notes the PC Engine extending ethos as well, comparing the PCFX to 1989's megaflop, the PC Engine Super Graphics, and the evidence is right there, inside the PCFX. When you strip away the PCFX's FMV capability, the additional 4 planes of 24-bit graphics, and a different CPU, what you have in many ways is a Super Graphics. It has a pair of PC Engine's C6270 chips like the Super Graphics, and the often overlooked sound chip of the PCFX is the C6230, which took the PC Engine's PSG sound and added ADPCM via an implementation of the Oki MSM6258, which itself appeared in 1987's Sharp X68000. Otherwise, if it wasn't for CD audio, it sounds for all of the world like a PC Engine, bar a couple of dedicated sound channels, usually used for voice clips. Had the PCFX had a C6280 from the PC Engine, it could have been a PC Engine and Super Graphics compatible system. Hiroyuki-san posits further that the CPU switch to the V810 was made relatively last minute as a panic response to the emerging specifications of other 5th generation consoles, and thus losing the PCFX's backward compatibility, although launching a 5th generation system with a C6280 as its sole CPU seems highly unlikely in 1994. Further bolstering a Super Graphics-esque approach to the hardware, the catalogue's diagram of how graphics were composited by the C6261 chip to make the PCFX display emphasises this design choice. The C6261 sandwiches all of the graphic sources together in a post-process fashion, and regardless of whether the new true colour background planes were used, moving sprites were still delivered by the 1987 PC Engine hardware. In of itself, this isn't a bad thing if the objective was to provide backwards compatibility, but it wasn't. It was combining old tech with new tech to deliver essential functions like sprites and audio. But let's go back to the PCFX and 3D for a moment, because the rumours around this are persistent. Notwithstanding Hiromasa Iwasaki's frank rebuttal and NEC saying 3D was not present due to expense, There are two things that still muddy the waters on the topic of the pcfx and 3D. The first stems from a contemporary article in Edge magazine, apparently of Superstar Soldier 3D, which has stimulated conversation on the pcfx's ability around 3D. The game was never released, and these screenshots are more or less all that exist of the game. The second detail that has muddied the waters about the pcfx and 3D is the PC expansion card released by NEC in 1995, the pcfx GA. This, when added to a compatible NEC PC98 or DOS-V machine, depending on the version purchased, not only had a pcfx on board, but a brand new 3D chip from Kubota and Hudson. Yes, Kubota as the agricultural equipment manufacturer. Back in the late 80s to mid-90s, they had some investment in high-end graphic workstations, a story in of itself. This chip was the HU-C6273, codenamed Aurora, and was a hardware 3D capable chip. In my research, I located a patent relating to the chip published on May 22nd, 1995, jointly between Hudson and Kubota, and was published by Itagaki Fumihiko, another stalwart of hudsonsoft. On his website, he lays bare the facts. Hudson had no intention of developing hardware 3D capability for the pcfx, and had done nothing to develop it either. And furthermore, it wasn't unduly worried by what it saw coming from other manufacturers. Therefore, it wasn't a case of 3D being dropped from the Tetsujin prototype. It never existed in the first place. To further compound Hudson's relaxed viewpoint as regards 3D, Itagaki-san states it was Kubota that approached Hudson first to develop such a 3D chip. Whilst the collaboration obviously went ahead, Hudson was still hesitant, leading to Itagaki-san working on the project before it was officially agreed to. The inclusion of the Aurora on the pcfx GA card was not a hint of things to come for the pcfx, as it was intended for the next generation of pcfx that never happened, and instead the development of the pcfx GA was commenced and the Aurora chip was included on that instead. Itagaki-san also added a couple of other interesting bits, in that the pcfx's C6271 chip, known as Rainbow, is not named after the colourful phenomenon in the sky, but rather rainbow trout, a fish, and likewise the C6272 chip in the pcfx is called King, as in king salmon known as a Chinook salmon in English. If I was to speculate, maybe a nod to Hudson co-founder Hiroshi Kudo's love of fishing. There are two figures given for total shipments of the pcfx. An assessment in 2001 in the Asahi Shimbun's Weekend Economics column suggested that 110,000 units were sold, and an earlier assessment in Famitsu suggests 290,000 units were shipped. When the Sega Dreamcast was announced in 1998, along with NEC's involvement in the Power VR2 graphics chip, the pcfx was dead, as was NEC's direct involvement in making games consoles. All in all, the pcfx saga is an unmitigated disaster when looking at it comparatively to the strong foundation the PC Engine built, and even if NEC and Hudson had played their cards better, the Sony juggernaut was formidable, and it soon became clear that the pcfx was not going to be anywhere near as successful as the PC Engine was. In the end, Hudson only supported the platform until mid-1996, with the last release being Super Power League FX, which looks in gameplay awfully like Power League 93, previously on HuCard, further bolstering musings on the pcfx being NEC's second attempt at bolstering the PC Engine with the Super Graphics approach. If I was to draw a Western analogy, the pcfx is to the PC Engine as Amiga's AGA is to the Amiga's original chipset. Drawing a conclusion to this saga, what we have here are two of the three pillars that would seriously harm Hudson. The first was misjudging the appeal of 3D to the consumer, and therefore being part responsible for a machine that flopped on the marketplace, and in addition to this, being late to getting serious about 3D development themselves. The second, putting their secondary focus on the Sega Saturn, a machine that itself would ultimately come third in the Japanese marketplace during the fifth generation. This directly led to them being very late to the PlayStation juggernaut, the ultimate 5th gen victor. But this alone wouldn't be enough to seriously harm Hudson. A third, more catastrophic thing that really wasn't their fault would occur. The effects of the Japanese economic collapse were about to fell some of its biggest victims.
銀行に対する不信が今北海道全体を覆う。銀行と共に築き上げてきた企業の夢はその崩壊とともにバブルの彼方に消え去った。宅銀という後ろ盾をなくした北海道。新しい時代に自らの力で歩み出そうとしている。